Narayanam namaskritya naram chaiva narottamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayam udirayet. We're going to be reciting 3:23:56. Nehayat karma dharmaya naviragaya kalpate natirtha pada sevayai jivan api mito hisaha. Nehayat karma dharmaya naviragaya kalpate natirtha pada sevayai jivan api mrito hisaha. Anyone whose work is not meant to elevate him to religious life, anyone whose religious ritualistic performances do not raise him to renunciation, and anyone situated in renunciation that does not lead him to devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead must be considered dead, although he is breathing. Pretty heavy. This is Devahuti. It's not like Bhaktisiddhanta. Okay, purport. Devahuti's statement is that since she was attached to living with her husband for sense gratification, which does not lead to liberation from material entanglement, her life was simply a waste of time. Any work one performs that does not lead to the state of religious life is useless activity. Everyone is by nature inclined to some sort of work, and when that work leads one to religious life, and religious life leads one to renunciation, and renunciation leads one to devotional service, one attains the perfection of work. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, any work that does not lead ultimately to the standard of devotional service is a cause of bondage in the material world. Yagnartat karmano nyatra lokoyam karma bandhanaha. Unless one is gradually elevated to the position of devotional service, beginning from his natural activity, he is to be considered a dead body. Work which does not lead one to the understanding of Krishna consciousness is considered useless. So there. Just a little, the context of this heavy statement is Devahuti is lamenting. This is the title of the chapter, Devahuti's Lamentation. And we discussed, we should consider, her son is Lord Vishnu. His name is Kapila, and Kapila gives certain teachings, but she knows, because it was foretold by Lord Vishnu to Kardama Muni before they were married, that he, Vishnu, would become his son. He would have 9 daughters and one son, and that one son is Vishnu. So she knew, her husband knew, she knew, and after the 9 daughters, Kapila was born. When Kapila became mature, as was a condition in becoming married to Devahuti, he would leave, and he left. That leaves Devahuti with her son without a husband, but the son is the personality of Godhead Vishnu, and so she's seeking teachings from her son how to extract herself from material circumstance of life as if she was entangled in the material circumstance of life. Now, so on the one hand and on the other hand, material circumstance, the arrangement between husband and wife, standard in this world, is a material arrangement, and commonly it's due to affinity. Although one may be religious, there's religious marriage. Let's say differently. In animal life, there's no religious marriage. The birds, the beasts, the fish, and etc., the insects, they don't have religious marriage. And religious marriage is for human beings to sanction the natural, innate male female attraction, which is material, but to bring it to a position where it's honored, sacred marriage, and go further with the Vedic system, some behaviors and do's and do nots within the realm of marriage. That's it's a subset of the religious dimension, not the transcendental. So she followed that procedure, and we discussed this last few days in Naperville. She, Devahuti, is very elevated Vaishnavi. She wanted as her husband someone who was fixed in the personality of Godhead. She left her palace life and went to the forest and lived a life of austerity like her husband, alongside her husband. And she was happy being with her most qualified husband. And then the time came that they would, after mutual he and she purification from their living the way that they were living in the forest, then came time for children. So she's attributing her affinity for this life of marriage with children as a fallen condition. And in one sense, if it's devoid of Krishna consciousness, it stays on the material platform, or as Prabhupada is saying, as Devahuti is saying, and the purport is saying several times, useless. So she's not useless. She is highly qualified, and she's asking all the right questions of the right person. And yet, because of her abject humility, she's feeling that's not my situation, or my situation is material affinity. And what great misfortune, even after the departure of my husband, which I knew he was going to leave because he got that sanction from my father, Swayambhuva Manu. Now I'm feeling these feelings of longing for his association, as if it's a material attachment. And let's take it that way. She's instructing how we, male or female, should regard our situation as being, we're not there yet, even one may be there. So what to speak of when you're not there yet? So it's the position of humility is appropriate, and abject humility for those that are realized like she is, and characterizing herself as not there yet. And the not yet folks have some or strong or addiction to affinity for material association and material enjoyment. As the verse was saying, the previous verse, sense gratification was used like 6 times. She's not a sense gratifier. Yet, she's characterizing herself that way in part to leave and continue to leave at a distance senses engaged in sense object for the purpose of enjoying. Now, Rishikena Rishikesha Sevanam, the senses engaged in the service of Rishikesh, that's how the senses are controlled, not just restraining the senses from sense objects. It's the mood of enjoyment as opposed to the mood of service, or the other way around. The mood of service as opposed to the mood of enjoyment. The previous verse was emphasizing how much, although she has this material attachment, this is Devahuti's Lamentation, is the title of the chapter. I was so attached. Now, is it possible to have a spiritual attachment? Yes. And is her husband, although he's not the personality of Godhead, as is her son, but was he not a realized soul, and thus a realized soul on the same platform, or to be honored like the personality of Godhead? Yes. So that's a spiritual attachment. It's not a material attachment. But she's characterizing herself as if she's attracted by due to material attachment. She's not pointing. I have material. So it's one of these hard to understand or puzzling or enigmatic dynamics where a transcendentalist like Devahuti has a desire for a husband, and in that desire for a husband, as is the case with material affinity, and quite naturally so, not abomination upon that person that has such affinity, but that affinity which leads to elevation and further elevation and further elevation. We discussed this at length. Humility and faith and other fundamental things to bhakti life. As bhakti grows and grows, they become more prominent and more robust and more mature. So her humility is in that department, and she's speaking of herself as if she's a materialist, meaning attached to sense gratification. That's how to understand how she's speaking about herself. And then the flip side is what's really going on with her. She's already there. She's not a sadhaka. She's a perfected person. And part of the character of the perfected person is they still have a healthy distance or even disdain between themselves and a life of sense gratification. So that's the place from which she's speaking. And there's this nice sequence. Anyone, so it's the role of work properly or improperly directed. So by and large, the improperly directed work is how everybody operates. We all do some work because the soul, part and parcel of the Supreme Soul, is active, and the soul that's active is in the field of matter, and so there's activity or work. And fruitive work is you do something to get something. And then, then material life fills up or fills out. And then one is this type, that type, the other type, and there's nomenclature for types. And but the foundation is hankering for independent enjoyment from the Supreme. That sense gratification. It's working to satisfy the senses. So her point is, since we all have to work, this is her declaration to Vishnu, her son, Lord Vishnu. Everyone does some type of work. I'm doing some type of work. We're all doing some type of work. That work should elevate one to religious life. And religious life should elevate one to renunciation. And renunciation did elevate oneself to the platform of devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without which that 1, 2, 3 sequence, it's useless. What does it's useless mean? Because it's not to. This is not an impersonalist kind of useless. The Vaishnava kind of uselessness is the goal is to be approached. Even you're not there yet, the goal is to be approached. And so we do things, we're using a microphone. And we're in a house and it's really cold out there, so we have the heat on. We're utilizing things with a purpose. Otherwise, it's just material. Whether it's, nice temperature or hot temperature or cold temperature or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The material circumstance stays on the material platform. Thus, for spiritual realization purposes or for the living entity's human life mission purpose, a waste of time. Even good activity, waste of time. Because good activity gets a good reaction, gets another good body, gets another bondage of another birth. And then transcendental, not just religious, but that this sequence: religious, renunciation, bhakti. Religious, renunciation, bhakti. It very similarly follows the path that's described in the first third of Bhagavad Gita. Detached work. Same idea. Everyone has to do some type of work because we're active, part and parcel of the Supreme, we're active. The Supreme Lord is unlimitedly, we're limitedly active, and we're in the field of material energy, so that's work. Active in the field of material energy equals work. And work is binding, because good or bad or mixed, there's a bondage to work. However, the advocacy of Bhagavad Gita is work with detachment, where the fruits are offered to the Supreme. And when the fruits are offered to the Supreme, there's detachment. There's religious life. So even at the lower parts of Vedas, we'll skip the karma yoga, karma kanda, just karma yoga. Karma yoga is when it becomes matured, one then becomes eligible for real detachment. Real detachment means attachment to Krishna. But even before attachment to Krishna is attachment to Brahman or reality, and therefore Gyan Yoga follows Karma Yoga. Traditionally, Gyan, the cultivation of knowledge to attain the Supreme or to link with the Supreme, follows Karma Yoga. We'll see it the other way around. Supposing one wants to be a Gyani, but one hasn't undergone the Karma Yoga sequence. Some activity, and one's going to be attached to the fruits of that activity, and there's no dhyan, there's no cultivation of Gyan Yoga. So, Karma Yoga, Gyan Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, that's the sequence. She's not using that language, but that's another way of saying what she's saying. Work that doesn't lead to religious life is useless. Work that leads to religious life means religious life is offering the fruits to the Supreme. And then if you offer the fruits to the Supreme, you may partake of the fruits as the Supreme gives in the form of prasad, but that your life is just receiving the mercy of the personality of Godhead. Work with detachment. But before that detachment is this religious life. So things are very well defined in Vedic concept, and minus the Vedic concept, things are a little fuzzy, or the spirit of the teaching becomes easily lost, all too often lost, because the discerning factor, the intelligence, isn't awakened, isn't sharp. Say it the other way. Supposing spiritual intelligence becomes awakened, then the distinctions between different stages of life, material, spiritual, spiritualizing through yajna process or sacrifice process and so forth, the stages become very, very clear through the message of Bhagavad Gita. And say it conversely again, commonly it's not very clear. Look closely. It's a nice thing to do. Look closely at any quote religious process or quote spiritual process, and these elements are there, but often little distorted, and for the follower or the reader, not clear. Vedic knowledge, everything's clear, very, very carefully spelled out, and there's a path to that spelled out process, and one needs a good teacher to take those teachings and become spiritually elevated, and then stay with it. There was I'm just going to share something. During this past weekend, Radhakrishna Prabhu was one of the co-speakers. The topic is going to be covered here, Vaishnava etiquette, 1 through 4. And he also spoke Vaishnava etiquette topic, same topic. His approach was somewhat different, and his emphasis was somewhat different, but that was the topic. And in the course of that discussion, his presentation, part of what he was doing was explaining that any process that's religious or spiritual process, it takes time. It's not like you're immersed in the river of material existence, and in the next moment you're dry on land. It takes a little time to transition from material to spiritual. It's not It's not something negative about the process of approaching the supreme. It's just a description that, generally speaking, even the most direct process, the bhakti process, it takes some time. So, to emphasize that, Radha Krishna told the story. It's a European philosopher who um, wrote something, described something about what his experience with a butterfly. Did you hear that one? The butterfly story. Butterfly story. So the butterfly hatches from a cocoon. The egg is by the mother is in the form of a cocoon, and the living entity is within the cocoon, and you don't see the butterfly in that cocoon. You see like a worm. And then over time, the metamorphosis process and the wings of the butterfly start to mature, develop, and the butterfly comes out of the cocoon instead of just a worm or a larva. So he, this European author, saw a cocoon, and he watched it, and it took a long time for the cocoon to mature, so he decided he would hasten it, something like that. And by his breath, he thought not too hot, but a little bit warmer circumstance, that it might help the gestation period of the cocoon, or the living entity living within that cocoon. Fast forward, it worked in that the butterfly came out before its normal course of time, but because the wings of the caterpillar now become a moth or some insect, was premature. That is to say, the whole narration is being narrated. Our sadhana practice takes time, and there are things that you can do to try to hasten it, but it's not hastened to the extent that you become impatient for the result. Don't be complacent. The result, I don't have to think about it too much. You're enthusiastic, but patience doesn't neutralize enthusiasm. It's a nice way of expressing the bhakti process takes time, even when done properly. The bhakti process, when not done properly, you can wait a long time for results. But the living entity that comes from that, the bhakti power that comes from that little gestation period, it has its spiritual foundation. So back to the sequence. Work culminating in religious. Religious culminating in renunciation. Renunciation culminating in bhakti. And that's very nice. That's Bhagavad Gita. And here we have the Bhagavatam. So Devahuti, is saying something quite similar. That is the sadhusanga mentioned from the previous series of verses in this chapter. I had fantastic facility being the wife of this perfected person. And he's gone. And I'm feeling separation. And so she's admonishing herself for her attachment. That attachment isn't the problem. Thinking the attachment is something material, that's the problem. And it leads to more bondage. Invariably. work, religious, religious renunciation, renunciation bhakti. That's where the sadhu comes in, because none of that happens without one who's carrying bhakti. And the fulfillment of human life, doing work in a regulated way, has an ultimate purpose: attachment to the Supreme Personality Godhead, and thus detachment even from the religious formulas. One may do them, religious formulas, or but when one does them, their purpose behind is more important than the ritual itself. So the chapter is almost done, but we're not going to be around for the rest of the chapter. It's 3 more verses. So if you want to read ahead, you can go ahead. Nice section. Do you need to replace the batteries? You're good. Okay. Anyone would like to comment or discuss? It depends. I mean, there's the sacrifice unto the Supreme, which itself is a ritual, which is religious. But karma yoga is supposing one does a ritual, but their heart is not oriented towards all of this is going to the Supreme. Then it stays on the platform of religious, but religious connected with yoga, religious connected with the purpose behind the activity, the ritual, the yajna, then it becomes spiritual. Same thing, different consciousness, different label, different outcome. They say any one of those things. Take karma, gyan, and bhakti. Strip the yoga element out, and it's material, material, material. So material religiosity, which is a contradiction of terms, but material religiosity, the connection with the Supreme is not clear, and how it works is not clear. But the ritual becomes everything. So there's religious formularies. There's distinctions between this religious group and that religious group, even within the same group. Anything else? You have something? Okay. Microphone? It depends. Generally, not. But in circumstance, yes. For example, the Bhaktivedanta Hospital. Or, for example, a school where the Bhaktivedanta, uh, whatever it is, educational institution, they're just opening one outside of Vrindavan. Somebody sent me an invitation. The Bhaktivedanta school. That's an opening of a school. So it resembles material, but it's not. Depends. The answer to your question is it depends. The microphone is not working. Is it the machine or is it your? Okay, so we don't need the microphone then. Go ahead. Oh yeah, yeah, that's for sure. You know, it depends. You know, there can be some. This is for God's work, attachment to God, or just attachment to doing good work. There's gradations of spiritualizing, or more or less. Well, what does totally attached mean? Totally detached mean? What does it mean? Totally detached means totally Krishna attached. Chapter 5 Bhagavad Gita. What is called renunciation is the same as working for the Supreme. So if you're totally attached to working for the Supreme, then you're totally detached. But supposing you're not working for the Supreme, you're supposing you're Tyagi. So totally detached, it depends on what one means by that. Yeah, and that's for a devotee, and then totally attached to Krishna. That's a very elevated state. Asakti. Anything else? You have something? Okay. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.